Listen carefully. There is a particular kind of pain that almost everyone experiences, yet very few people truly understand. It is not the pain of failure. It is not the pain of loss. And it is not even the pain of heartbreak. It is the pain of rejection. Not being hated, not being attacked, not being betrayed, simply not being chosen. Think about that for a moment. Somewhere in your life, there was probably a person whose attention mattered more than it should have. Maybe it was someone you loved. Maybe it was someone you admired. Maybe it was someone whose approval seemed capable of changing how you saw yourself. You invested your thoughts into them, your time, your emotions, perhaps even your future. And then one day, whether directly or indirectly, they sent a message. Not always with words, sometimes with silence, sometimes with distance, sometimes with indifference. But the message felt the same. You are not enough. What makes rejection so devastating is that it rarely feels like a simple event. It feels personal, deeply personal. A stranger rejecting you rarely leaves a scar, but when someone important rejects you, something inside you begins to question itself. You start replaying conversations, analyzing mistakes, searching for explanations, wondering what you should have done differently. You become both the prosecutor and the accused inside your own mind. And this is where most people misunderstand rejection. They believe they are suffering because they lost someone. But often, that is not what hurts the most. What hurts is losing the version of yourself that expected to be chosen. The future you imagined. The story you were already living in your head. The identity you quietly built around the possibility that this person would validate your worth. When that possibility disappears, it can feel as if a piece of your identity disappears with it. That is why rejection creates such intense emotional reactions. People chase, they explain, they plead, they negotiate, they over-invest, they seek closure, they send one more message, then another, then another. Not because they are trying to reconnect with the other person, but because they are desperately trying to repair the damage done to their own self-image. And strangely, the harder they try, the worse things become. The more attention they give, the less attention they receive. The more available they become, the less valued they seem. The more they chase, the further the other person moves away. It is one of the most frustrating paradoxes of human relationships. The very behaviors people use to regain attraction often destroy it. The very actions they believe will bring someone closer often push them further away. Why? Why does desperation make people less attractive? Why does excessive pursuit create resistance? Why does absence sometimes create more desire than presence? And why is it that people often become interested only after someone has finally stopped chasing them? These questions have fascinated philosophers, psychologists, strategists, and observers of human nature for centuries. Even Niccolo Machiavelli understood that human beings are rarely driven by logic alone. We are influenced by perception, emotion, scarcity, status, and countless unconscious forces operating beneath our awareness. The truth is that rejection reveals something most people spend their entire lives trying to avoid. It exposes the hidden relationship between desire and value, between attention and power, between neediness and attraction. Most people see rejection as an ending, a closed door, a final verdict on their worth. But what if they are wrong? What if rejection is not a verdict at all? What if it is a lesson? What if the pain you experienced was never meant to destroy you, but to reveal something about human nature that most people never discover? Perhaps rejection is not the end of attraction. Perhaps it is the beginning of understanding human nature. To understand why rejection hurts so deeply, you must first understand something about the human mind that most people never think about. Your brain was not designed for the modern world. It was designed for survival. Long before smartphones, social media, cities, governments, and modern relationships existed, human beings lived in small tribes. Survival depended on belonging. Food was shared. Protection was collective. Knowledge was passed through groups. To be accepted by the tribe meant safety. To be excluded meant danger and sometimes death. For thousands of years, isolation was not simply uncomfortable, it was a threat. The human nervous system evolved around this reality. This is why rejection feels far more intense than logic suggests it should. Part of your mind does not interpret rejection as a social inconvenience. It interprets it as a survival problem, a signal that something important has been lost, a signal that your place within the group may be uncertain. This ancient wiring still exists inside every human being. Even though the modern world has changed dramatically, your emotional systems remain surprisingly similar to those of your ancestors. This is why a text message can ruin someone's day. Why being ignored can feel unbearable. Why social exclusion can trigger anxiety that seems completely disproportionate to the situation. The logical mind may understand that survival is not actually at risk, but the emotional brain responds as though it is, and this reveals something fascinating. Human beings are not driven solely by physical needs. They are driven by psychological needs as well. The need for validation, the need for acceptance, the need for belonging, the need to feel significant. These invisible forces shape countless decisions throughout life. They influence friendships, relationships, careers, politics, even entire social movements. Niccolo Machiavelli understood something similar centuries ago. He observed that human behavior is often driven less by objective reality and more by perception. People do not simply react to what is happening. They react to what events mean. And rejection carries powerful meaning. It appears to answer a question many people secretly fear asking: am I enough? This is why rejection rarely feels like the loss of a person alone. It feels like the loss of certainty. The future you imagined suddenly disappears. The story you created begins to collapse. The emotional investment you made no longer has a destination. What hurts is not merely what happened. What hurts is what could have happened. The possibilities. The imagined future, the version of reality that now exists only inside your mind. And perhaps most importantly, rejection takes away something human beings desperately want: control. Most people believe they are comfortable with uncertainty. In reality, uncertainty is one of the most psychologically uncomfortable experiences imaginable. The mind wants answers. It wants explanations. It wants closure. It wants certainty. Yet rejection often provides none of these things, and that is where the suffering intensifies. Because uncertainty creates obsession. A clear no can eventually be accepted, but ambiguity is different. Ambiguity keeps the mind working, searching, questioning, replaying, analyzing. This is one reason social media has become such a powerful emotional force. A person can see your message and not respond, view your story and say nothing. Remain present while simultaneously remaining unavailable. The uncertainty becomes addictive. You begin looking for clues, signals, hidden meanings, anything that might restore a sense of certainty. Ironically, being ignored often feels more painful than being criticized. Criticism provides information. Silence provides questions, and unanswered questions have a remarkable ability to occupy the human mind. This is not weakness, it is human nature. The same psychological mechanisms that once helped our ancestors survive can now trap us inside cycles of overthinking and emotional dependence. Which brings us to a difficult realization. Many people say they fear rejection, but that is not entirely true. What they truly fear is what rejection might reveal, what it might say about their value, their desirability, their identity, their place in the world. And perhaps that is why one statement captures the experience so perfectly. I am not afraid of rejection. I am afraid of what rejection reveals about me. So consider this carefully. Think about the last rejection you experienced. Pause for a moment and be completely honest with yourself. Was it really about losing the person, or was it about losing the story you built around them? Because the answer to that question may reveal far more about human nature than the rejection itself. Why chasing creates resistance. Now we arrive at one of the most uncomfortable truths about human behavior. A truth that most people experience repeatedly but rarely understand. The harder you chase something, the more likely it is to move away from you. At first glance, this seems irrational. After all, society teaches us the opposite. We are told to pursue what we want, to work harder, to show commitment, to prove ourselves, to never give up. And in many areas of life, this advice makes perfect sense. But human relationships do not always follow the logic of effort. In fact, some of the most important social dynamics operate according to entirely different rules. Consider a simple observation. Have you ever noticed that people often become interested in someone only after that person stops seeking their attention? Have you ever seen someone ignore a person who desperately wanted them only to become curious? Once that attention disappeared, why does this happen? Why does pursuit sometimes destroy the very thing it hopes to create? The answer lies deep within human psychology. There is a principle known as psychological reactance. It is one of the most powerful and misunderstood forces influencing human behavior. Whenever people feel that their freedom is being restricted, they instinctively resist, not because the alternative is better, but because autonomy matters. The moment a person feels pressured, manipulated, cornered, or emotionally pushed, a part of them begins moving in the opposite direction. This happens in relationships, it happens in politics, it happens in advertising, it happens in negotiations, and it happens whenever human beings feel their ability to choose is being threatened. The irony is that most people create this pressure without realizing it. When rejection occurs, they increase their efforts. They send more messages, they seek more explanations, they ask for more reassurance, they invest more attention. But the other person experiences something entirely different. What feels like affection to one person can feel like pressure to another. And pressure often creates resistance. This is where the paradox begins. The more desperately you pursue someone's approval, the more you communicate that you need it. And human beings are remarkably sensitive to signals of need. Not because they consciously analyze them, but because they instinctively feel them. Constant pursuit unconsciously communicates several messages. It suggests dependence. It suggests emotional imbalance. It suggests a lack of alternatives, and sometimes it suggests a lack of self-worth. Whether fair or unfair, these signals influence perception. People begin asking themselves a question they may never verbalize. If this person values me so much more than they value themselves, what do they know that I don't? And suddenly, attraction begins to weaken. Not because the pursuer lacks value, but because value is often judged through perception rather than reality. Niccolò Machiavelli understood this principle centuries ago. While discussing power and influence, he repeatedly emphasized that perception often matters as much as substance. Human beings rarely evaluate things objectively. They evaluate them relative to scarcity, status, and appearance. This tendency exists everywhere. People value rare opportunities, exclusive experiences, limited resources, difficult achievements, not necessarily because they are better, but because scarcity changes perception. The same principle frequently appears in human attraction. What appears difficult to obtain often seems more valuable. What appears guaranteed often loses some of its perceived worth. This does not mean people should play games, nor does it mean emotional manipulation creates genuine connection. It means human beings are influenced by mystery, by uncertainty, by possibility. And excessive availability often removes those elements completely, when every thought is expressed immediately, when every feeling is revealed instantly, when every moment is spent seeking reassurance. The unknown disappears, and with it, much of the psychological tension that fuels curiosity, because attraction is not always built upon certainty. Very often, it grows inside uncertainty, inside unanswered questions, inside possibility. This is why the following statement feels almost uncomfortable in its accuracy. The moment you make someone your only option, you often stop becoming theirs. Read that again, because hidden within that sentence is a profound shift in perspective. Most people spend their lives chasing value, chasing attention, chasing approval, chasing validation. But perhaps the real transformation begins when a person adopts a different identity altogether. I do not chase value, I become valuable. That identity changes everything, because people who understand their own value stop negotiating for basic respect. They stop convincing others to recognize what should already be obvious. They stop treating another person's attention as proof of their worth. And when that shift occurs, something fascinating begins to happen. The pursuit slows down. The desperation fades. The need for validation weakens. For the first time, the individual begins reclaiming control of their emotional world. But this creates an even deeper question, a question that reveals the hidden mechanism behind desire itself. What happens when a person stops pursuing completely? What happens when the chase ends, and what emerges in the silence that follows? At this point, many people begin hearing the phrase reverse psychology and immediately think of manipulation, a trick, a tactic, a way to control someone else's behavior, but that understanding barely scratches the surface. True reverse psychology is not primarily about controlling others. It is about understanding something fundamental about human nature. People want to feel free. They want to feel independent. They want to feel that their choices belong to them. This desire runs deeper than most people realize. Human beings can tolerate pain. They can tolerate uncertainty. They can even tolerate failure. But they resist feeling controlled. The moment people sense that their freedom is being threatened, something inside them pushes back. Not necessarily because they disagree, not necessarily because they have a better alternative, but because autonomy itself has value. This principle appears everywhere once you learn to recognize it. A child is told not to touch something. Suddenly, it becomes irresistible. A consumer is told they must buy a product. Interest decreases. An employee feels excessively controlled by management. Motivation begins to disappear. The pattern repeats itself endlessly. Human beings do not simply seek outcomes, they seek ownership of their decisions. And this is where reverse psychology becomes fascinating. At its deepest level, reverse psychology works because it removes pressure. It removes force. It removes the feeling of being pushed. When resistance disappears, curiosity often takes its place. Think about relationships. When someone constantly seeks validation, reassurance, and attention, the interaction can begin to feel emotionally heavy. Not because affection is wrong, but because expectation creates pressure, and pressure creates resistance. Then something changes. The pursuit stops. The pressure disappears, the emotional demands fade, and suddenly the other person experiences something they were not experiencing before. Space, freedom, silence. And surprisingly, silence often speaks louder than words. Most people assume communication is about speaking, but some of the most powerful messages are communicated through absence. When someone constantly argues, explains, or defends themselves, their message becomes predictable. But when they stop, the mind begins filling in the gaps. Questions emerge, curiosity awakens, interpretations multiply. This is because uncertainty activates attention. The human mind is naturally drawn toward incomplete information. It wants resolution. It wants understanding. It wants closure. This is why silence can sometimes create more psychological movement than 100 conversations, because silence forces people to engage with their own thoughts, and those thoughts often become more persuasive than any argument. Consider politics. Throughout history, leaders have understood the power of withholding information, not because secrecy is always beneficial, but because uncertainty captures attention. People become fascinated by what they cannot fully access. Machiavelli understood this dynamic centuries ago. While many people remember him only for discussions of power, he was fundamentally a student of human behavior. He recognized that perception often shapes reality. People react not only to what is present, they react to what is absent, to what is uncertain, to what remains unresolved. The same principle appears in marketing. A product described as limited suddenly becomes desirable. A rare opportunity gains value. An exclusive invitation becomes attractive. The object itself may not have changed, but perception has. Scarcity creates contrast, and contrast creates attention. Human beings rarely notice what is always available. They notice what might disappear. The same psychological mechanism often influences attraction, not because people enjoy playing games, but because mystery naturally stimulates curiosity. When every answer is available immediately, curiosity has nowhere to go. When every emotion is explained instantly, imagination has little work to do. When every moment is filled with constant communication, psychological tension disappears. And tension is often the birthplace of desire. This leads us to a statement that sounds simple, but contains profound wisdom. Silence is not always weakness. Sometimes it is information. Think about that carefully. Silence communicates confidence. Silence communicates boundaries. Silence communicates acceptance of reality, and sometimes silence communicates something even more powerful: self-respect. This is why emotional distance should never be confused with manipulation. The healthiest form of emotional distance is not designed to create desire. It is designed to create clarity. It allows people to see situations without desperation clouding their judgment. It allows emotions to settle. It allows autonomy to return, and when autonomy returns, resistance often fades. This creates a powerful identity shift, one that many people spend years learning. I refuse to force what is unwilling. That statement is not weakness. It is emotional maturity. It is the recognition that genuine connection cannot be negotiated into existence. It cannot be argued into existence. And it certainly cannot be forced into existence, which reveals the deeper truth behind reverse psychology. The goal is not making someone want you. The goal is removing the conditions that make them resist you. And once that happens, an entirely different question begins to emerge. A question that changes everything. What if the greatest transformation has nothing to do with changing another person's mind? What if it begins with changing your own identity? Disruption. This is the point where most people expect a strategy, a technique, a psychological trick that will suddenly make someone miss them, want them, chase them. But if you've followed the journey this far, you may have noticed something unusual. The deeper we travel into human psychology, the less this conversation becomes about changing another person, and the more it becomes about changing yourself. Because hidden beneath rejection, pursuit, and reverse psychology is an assumption that many people never question. The assumption that attraction is something granted by others. That value comes from being chosen. That worth is confirmed through external approval. Most people spend years operating under this belief without realizing it. They believe confidence comes after acceptance, that happiness comes after validation, that self-worth arrives once someone else finally recognizes their value. But what if the entire equation is backwards? What if attraction does not begin with how others see you? What if it begins with how you see yourself? This is where everything starts to change, because rejection has a strange ability. It exposes weaknesses that success often hides. Not to punish you, not to shame you, but to reveal what was already there. Think about what rejection actually uncovers. It exposes emotional dependence. It reveals attachment. It reveals hidden insecurities. It reveals the places where your identity has become connected to someone else's opinion. And while that realization can be painful, it can also be incredibly liberating, because you cannot strengthen what you refuse to see. Many people spend years trying to heal rejection while completely ignoring the deeper wound underneath it. The addiction to validation, the need to be approved of, the desire to feel worthy through another person's attention. And perhaps this is one of the greatest illusions in modern life. People call it love. People call it attraction. People call it connection. But often what they are experiencing is something else entirely. Validation dependency. The belief that another person's affection will finally provide the sense of worth they have been unable to create for themselves. This is why rejection can feel so devastating, because it threatens more than a relationship. It threatens an identity, the identity that says, if this person chooses me, then I matter. If this person stays, then I am enough. If this person approves of me, then I can finally feel valuable. But identities built upon external approval are fragile, because they place your emotional stability in someone else's hands. And eventually, life finds a way to expose that weakness. Machiavelli understood a version of this principle when discussing power. A person who depends entirely on external forces can never truly feel secure. Because their stability exists outside of their control, the same principle applies psychologically. The more your worth depends on another person's decision, the less power you possess over your own emotional state. This realization is uncomfortable, but it is also transformative, because once you see it, you can no longer pretend not to. And this leads to a question that deserves complete honesty. If the person who rejected you suddenly returned tomorrow, if they sent the message, made the call, expressed the interest you once desperately wanted, would your life actually be different, or would you simply experience temporary relief? Think carefully, because there is a profound difference between love and validation, between connection and approval, between desire and emotional dependency. Many people are not chasing a person, they are chasing the feeling of being chosen, and until that distinction becomes clear, they remain trapped in the same cycle, seeking external confirmation for an internal problem. This is the turning point, the moment where the focus shifts away from changing someone else's mind and toward rebuilding your own identity, not through arrogance, not through superiority, but through self-respect, through self-awareness, through emotional independence. An identity capable of standing on its own. An identity that does not collapse when approval disappears. An identity that understands a powerful truth. My worth is not determined by another person's decision. Read that slowly, because that statement changes everything. When you truly believe it, rejection loses its ability to define you. Attention loses its ability to control you. Validation loses its ability to enslave you. And for the first time, your value stops being something you seek. It becomes something you embody. That is the moment everything changes, not when someone else chooses you, but when you stop needing them to. Once you begin looking beyond personal relationships, a remarkable pattern starts to emerge. The same psychological forces that shape attraction also shape history. They shape politics, leadership, status, influence, and power itself. Because at its core, human behavior has always been driven by perception, not just reality. Perception. Throughout history, countless individuals have possessed power without appearing powerful, and countless others have appeared powerful without truly possessing it. This distinction matters because human beings rarely respond to objective truth alone. They respond to stories, symbols, signals, appearances. This was one of Niccolo Machiavelli's most important observations. Despite the many myths surrounding his work, Machiavelli was not merely teaching manipulation, he was studying reality. He was attempting to understand why people behave the way they do, why leaders rise, why empires fall, why influence succeeds where force often fails. Again and again, he arrived at the same conclusion. Human beings are deeply influenced by perception. People respond not only to what exists, they respond to what appears to exist. And while that truth can be uncomfortable, it remains visible everywhere. Consider scarcity. A resource becomes limited. Suddenly, its value increases, not because its objective qualities have changed, but because access has changed. The perception of rarity transforms the perception of worth. The same principle appears throughout human history. Rare opportunities, exclusive memberships, elite institutions, powerful positions. Their desirability often increases because they are difficult to obtain. Human beings naturally associate scarcity with value. This does not make them irrational, it makes them human. Machiavelli recognized that influence often depends less on what people possess and more on how others perceive what they possess. The lesson is not to manipulate perception, the lesson is to understand its power, because understanding human nature allows you to navigate it more intelligently. And perhaps nowhere is this more relevant than in modern life. Today, entire industries operate on perception. Social media platforms transform attention into status. Followers become signals, likes become social proof, visibility becomes influence. People carefully curate images of their lives, often creating a version of reality designed to shape how others perceive them. Yet beneath all the technology, the psychology remains ancient. The same instincts that influenced tribes thousands of years ago now influence digital communities. The same desire for acceptance remains. The same sensitivity to status remains. The same attraction to scarcity remains. Even in dating, many people unknowingly participate in this dynamic. They believe attraction is created through constant effort. Yet often what matters more is how a person perceives themselves. Confidence changes perception. Purpose changes perception. Independence changes perception. And perception influences attraction. The same principle appears in professional life. Consider two individuals with identical skills. One reacts emotionally to every setback. The other remains composed under pressure. Who appears more capable? Who appears more trustworthy? Who appears more influential? In many situations, emotional control becomes a signal of competence. Not because the individual is superior, but because composure communicates stability. This is why emotional self-control has always been associated with leadership. History repeatedly rewards those capable of managing themselves before attempting to manage others. Because power without self-control eventually becomes self-destruction. This is another lesson hidden within Machiavellian thinking. True strength is rarely impulsive. True influence is rarely reactive. True power is often quiet, measured, disciplined, and intentional. The person who immediately reacts to every insult, rejection, disappointment, or challenge becomes predictable. And predictability creates vulnerability. But the person who remains emotionally grounded maintains options, and options create leverage. This leads us to a principle that extends far beyond relationships, a principle relevant to business, leadership, influence, and personal growth alike. The person who controls their emotions controls their options. Think about how many poor decisions are made during moments of emotional intensity. How many opportunities are destroyed by impatience? How many relationships are damaged by impulsive reactions? How many careers are altered by temporary emotions? Emotions themselves are not the problem. They are part of being human. The challenge is allowing emotions to become your master rather than your advisor. Because once emotions take complete control, perspective begins to disappear. And without perspective, wisdom becomes difficult. This is why the deepest lesson history offers is not about controlling others. It is about controlling yourself, not through suppression, not through cold detachment, but through awareness. The awareness to pause before reacting, the awareness to think before pursuing, the awareness to recognize that your value does not increase or decrease based on another person's opinion. That awareness creates freedom, and freedom creates influence, which leads to an identity worth carrying forward. I choose influence over impulse. Because the moment you stop being controlled by every emotional reaction is often the moment you begin shaping your own future. And that realization prepares us for the final transformation. A transformation where rejection itself begins to lose its power. Now we arrive at the deeper meaning hidden within the title of this discussion, because by this point you may have realized something unexpected. Transforming rejection into desire is not really about making another person desire you. It is not about creating obsession. It is not about psychological tricks, and it is certainly not about manipulating someone's emotions. The real transformation is far more profound. It is about transforming your relationship with rejection itself. Most people spend their lives treating rejection as evidence. Evidence that they are not attractive enough, not successful enough, not intelligent enough, not worthy enough. They treat rejection as a verdict, a final judgment on their value. But rejection is rarely a verdict. More often, it is information. Information about compatibility, information about timing, information about priorities, information about reality. The problem is that people often personalize information that was never meant to define them, and in doing so, they surrender their power. This is where the shift begins. The moment you stop asking, "How do I make them want me?" and start asking, "How do I build a life that I genuinely want to live?" Everything changes, because your attention finally moves away from control and toward growth. Consider how much energy people spend seeking immediate validation. A text message, a compliment, a reaction, a sign of interest, a confirmation that they matter. There is nothing wrong with enjoying validation. The danger appears when validation becomes a necessity rather than a bonus, because anything you need emotionally gains power over you. This is why emotional independence is so important, not because it makes you cold, not because it makes you detached, but because it allows your self-worth to remain stable regardless of external circumstances. Machiavelli often wrote about power in terms of dependence. The less dependent a ruler became on unpredictable external forces, the more secure their position became. The same principle applies psychologically. The less dependent you become on external approval, the more stable your emotional world becomes. And stability creates confidence, real confidence, not performance, not arrogance, not superiority. Confidence rooted in self-respect, confidence rooted in purpose, confidence rooted in knowing who you are, even when no one is applauding. This is why one of the most effective responses to rejection is surprisingly simple. Invest in yourself, not as revenge, not to make someone regret losing you, but because your life deserves your attention. Develop your skills, strengthen your mind, improve your health, pursue meaningful goals, build relationships that enrich your life. Create a future that excites you independently of anyone else's approval, because purpose has a remarkable effect on human psychology. When people have no purpose, they often become consumed by relationships. But when they possess a compelling mission, relationships become part of life rather than the center of it. This creates a subtle but powerful shift. Instead of convincing others of your value, you begin expressing it naturally. Instead of chasing attention, you direct your attention toward growth. Instead of proving your worth, you embody it. And paradoxically, this is often when people become more attractive. Not because they are trying harder, but because they have stopped trying to manufacture attraction. There is something inherently compelling about a person who is genuinely engaged with their own life. A person who has direction. A person who has standards. A person who has meaning beyond external validation. Human beings instinctively recognize authenticity because authenticity cannot be faked for long. It emerges from alignment between values and actions, alignment between identity and behavior, alignment between what a person says and what a person does. This is why desire often follows authenticity more naturally than performance. Performance seeks approval. Authenticity seeks truth. Performance constantly asks, how should I appear? Authenticity asks, who am I becoming? And that question changes everything. Because once your focus shifts toward becoming, the need to convince begins to disappear. You no longer need everyone to understand you. You no longer need everyone to choose you. You no longer need every rejection to become a personal crisis. Instead, you develop a new identity, one built on clarity rather than validation, one built on purpose rather than approval, one built on self-respect rather than dependence. An identity summarized by a simple but transformative statement. I do not seek approval. I seek alignment. Alignment with my values, alignment with my purpose, alignment with the life I want to create. And when that alignment becomes stronger than your need for validation, something extraordinary happens. Rejection loses its power to wound your identity. Because your identity is no longer waiting for someone else to define it. And in that moment, what once felt like rejection begins transforming into something else entirely. Freedom. Now return to where this journey began. Return to that moment of rejection, that unanswered message, that fading connection, that person who walked away, that painful feeling of not being chosen. At the beginning of this discussion, it may have seemed like that rejection was the problem, the obstacle, the wound, the thing standing between you and the life you wanted. But now, after exploring the psychology of pursuit, desire, perception, power, and identity, a different possibility begins to emerge. What if rejection was never the enemy? What if the real source of suffering was something else entirely? What if the pain came from attachment, not attachment to the person, but attachment to validation, attachment to approval, attachment to the belief that your worth depended on another person's decision? Because when you examine rejection closely enough, something surprising becomes visible. Rejection does not create insecurity. It reveals insecurity. It does not create dependence. It exposes dependence. It does not define your value. It reveals how much of your value you have allowed others to define. And while that realization may be uncomfortable, it is also incredibly liberating. Because once you understand the true source of the pain, you stop fighting the wrong battle. You stop trying to force attraction. You stop trying to negotiate for approval. You stop trying to convince people of your worth, and instead, you begin building a life that reflects it. This is the hidden transformation, the transformation that most people never experience because they become trapped in the pursuit itself. They spend years trying to be chosen, years trying to be validated, years trying to become enough for someone else. Without realizing, they abandon themselves in the process. But now you see something different. You see rejection as information. information about compatibility, information about timing, information about alignment. You see rejection as redirection, a force that pushes you toward greater self-awareness, greater independence, greater purpose, and perhaps most importantly, greater freedom. Because freedom begins the moment your identity is no longer dependent on another person's approval. Think about that. How many decisions have people made simply to avoid rejection? How many opportunities have they ignored? How many versions of themselves have they hidden? How many dreams have they abandoned? All because they feared not being chosen. Yet the individuals who leave the deepest mark on history rarely build their lives around approval. They build their lives around purpose. Machiavelli understood that power begins with understanding human nature, but perhaps the greatest understanding of all is recognizing your own, recognizing your fears, your attachments, your need for validation, and then gradually outgrowing them. Because the greatest form of emotional power is not influencing others. It is no longer being controlled by their opinions. And that brings us to one final truth. Sometimes the door that closes is the reason you finally stop knocking. Sometimes the rejection that breaks your heart is the event that rebuilds your identity. Sometimes losing what you wanted reveals what you actually needed. And perhaps the greatest reverse psychology of all is becoming someone who no longer needs to be pursued, chosen, or validated. Take a moment and reflect honestly. What if the rejection that hurt you most was actually the event that forced you to discover your real value? What if the experience you once called a loss was actually the beginning of your transformation? Because once you stop measuring your worth through the eyes of others, everything changes. Your confidence becomes real, your decisions become intentional, your relationships become healthier, your purpose becomes clearer, and your life becomes your own. If you're fascinated by psychology, human nature, Machiavellian strategy, emotional mastery, and the hidden forces that shape behavior, consider subscribing, because these are the kinds of ideas we explore regularly. Not to manipulate others, but to better understand ourselves. And in the end, that may be the most valuable knowledge of all. Remember this: the moment you stop needing approval is often the moment you become impossible to ignore.